Right, so we're diving into some Thomas Reid today, and uh, I think it's safe to say that you're a bit of a philosophy buff,
I've been known to dabble.
more than dabble. I think we can skip the philosophy 101 today and jump right into some of the deeper stuff with Reid.
Sounds good to me.
Let's think of it as like Thomas Reid for philosophers.
Okay, I like that.
So, what is it about Reid that you find so fascinating?
Well, for me, it's how he grapples with these huge questions, like perception or free will, even aesthetics. But he always brings it back to this idea of common sense. And by that, he doesn't just mean like everyday opinions, but a fundamental set of beliefs that we all kind of just have.
Hmm.
It's like he's using this common sense as a tool to kind of take on some of the big names of his time, like Locke Berkeley and especially Hume.
Right, so it's not so much like what does the average person think? It's more like what are the most basic beliefs that we all share about how the world works?
Yeah, exactly. And he uses that as a starting point to launch into some pretty heavy critiques. And a good example of that is how he takes on this idea called the way of ideas.
Okay, so for those of us who maybe haven't been brushing up on our 18th century philosophy, what exactly is this way of ideas? What is it that Reid is pushing back against?
So the way of ideas basically says that our minds are full of these mental representations that they call ideas, right? And
Yeah.
these ideas are like what we experience instead of the world directly.
Okay.
So let's say you're looking at a tree. You're not really seeing the tree itself. You're actually experiencing an idea of the tree that's in your mind.
So, like, there's this kind of a barrier between us and the real world. We're not actually experiencing things directly, just these mental copies of them.
That's pretty much it. And Reid really disagrees with this whole idea. He says it leads to skepticism because if all we ever know are these ideas, then how can we ever be sure that anything actually exists outside of our own minds?
Right, right.
Mm.
And I think that's a pretty intuitive thing to push back on. Like, it makes sense to think that we are actually seeing a tree when we look at a tree.
Exactly. And he also just didn't think that it matched up with our lived experience.
Yeah. So, how does he start to dismantle this way of ideas?
Mm.
Where does he even begin?
He starts with perception.
Okay.
He comes up with this idea called direct realism, which is the idea that we perceive the world directly, not through these ideas. And one of his coolest arguments has to do with visual perception and something called visible figure.
Visible figure. Okay, now I'm interested. Tell me more about that.
Okay, so picture you're looking at a table.
Right. Okay.
Now, as you walk around it, the size and shape of the table that you see seems to change,
Right. Yeah.
right? That's
Yeah.
its visible figure. So it's the way it looks to you from your perspective. Reed's argument is that this visible figure isn't just some mental representation that's in your head.
Hmm.
It's an actual property of the table itself. Like it's a real relationship between the table and your eye.
So even though the way the table looks might change as we move around it, we're still seeing the actual table, not some sort of picture of the table in our mind.
Exactly. And Reed saw this as a big problem for the whole idea of mental representations.
Mhm.
If something as simple as like how a table looks can be explained as this direct relationship, then he says maybe we don't need these ideas to explain perception at all.
Yeah, and I think this is where it starts to make sense, like how he's using common sense to challenge some of these really complicated ideas.
Hmm.
It feels like a very natural way to think about it. Like we're seeing the table, we're not seeing a copy of the table in our minds.
Right.
And then he takes this even further with this whole thing about primary and secondary quality.
Yeah, he does.
It's been a minute since my last philosophy class. So
Yeah.
remind me, what is that distinction between primary and secondary qualities? And then how does that fit into Reid's whole direct realism thing?
Okay, so Locke, way back when, he argued that primary qualities are things like size and shape and motion, and these qualities exist in the object itself, whereas secondary qualities are things like color, taste, smell. Those are more like powers of the object to produce sensations in us.
Right. So like a ball's roundness that's primary, that exists no matter what.
Mm.
But its redness is secondary, that only exists because of how light interacts with our eyes.
Exactly. And Reed actually agrees with Locke on that basic difference. He doesn't say that like there's a little red patch in your mind when you look at a red apple or anything, but he takes that difference in a whole other direction.
Okay, so where does he go from there?
So he says that while our sensations of secondary qualities might not actually resemble those qualities like they are in the world, our perception of the primary qualities, those give us direct knowledge of objects as they are.
Oh, okay.
So when you see a square object, you're directly seeing the squareness, not just some idea or representation of squareness.
So I'm seeing the squareness, but the redness of the apple is more about how I'm seeing it. Like
Right.
it's about my relationship with the apple.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And this helps Reid to say that we don't need these mental representations. It's like he's saying, look, we can explain our knowledge of the world through these direct relationships without needing to create these weird ideas in our minds.
Hmm. It's really interesting how he takes this very abstract philosophical problem and makes it feel very real and relatable.
That's Reid for you.
Now, Reid also has this whole theory of conception, right?
He does.
And that seems like it's really important to his overall philosophy.
Hmm.
So what's special about his idea of conception, and how does it fit into his rejection of this way of ideas?
So for Reid, conception is all about how we form thoughts about things.
Okay.
Now, the way of ideas would say we can only think about the ideas themselves, right? But Reid says we can actually think about things that don't even exist, like unicorns or a perfect circle.
Wait, you're saying that we can think about things that aren't real?
Yeah, it sounds a bit strange.
It does.
But it's actually a really clever move, because by saying that we can conceive of non-existent things, he's actually defending our ability to directly grasp what we're thinking about.
So, like if I'm thinking about a unicorn, I'm directly thinking about a unicorn,
Yeah.
not just like a fuzzy mental picture of a unicorn.
That's exactly it.
Okay.
And this links back to his direct realism.
Okay.
He's basically saying, look, we have direct access to our own thoughts. We don't need these ideas as a middleman to explain how thinking works.
So it's like he's clearing away all the clutter.
Exactly.
No more ideas between us and the world.
Yeah,
That's pretty bold.
it is. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on to tackle even bigger ideas, like causation and free will.
Whoa, my brain is getting a little full here.
Hmm.
Maybe we need to take a little break and then come back and tackle those other topics like causation and free will.
Yeah, let's do that.
All right, ready to dive back into the world of Thomas Reid.
Let's do it.
Last time we were talking about his theory of conception, how it challenged the way of ideas. But now let's move on to another big one, causation.
Oh, yeah?
I know Reid had some pretty strong opinions about Hume's take on causation.
Oh, he did. This is where his whole common sense approach really comes into play. So Hume, as you know, was super skeptical about causation. He thought, all we can really observe is one event happening after another. We never actually experience this, like, necessary connection between cause and effect.
Right. He thought our idea of causation was just a habit we've developed from seeing things happen together over and over again.
Exactly. But Reid wasn't buying it.
So he thought there was more to it than that.
Yeah, he argued that just because we don't have a direct sensory experience of this necessary connection, that doesn't mean our concept of causation is wrong.
Hmm.
He said a lot of our most basic concepts aren't just derived from sense experience.
So while we might not be able to see or touch causation, we still have an understanding of it that goes beyond just observing things happening in sequence.
That's exactly what Reid thought. He believed we have a direct, intuitive grasp of causation. He saw it as a fundamental principle that shapes how we understand the world. And he also pointed out some problems with Hume's view.
Like what?
Well, for one, he argued that Hume's definition of causation as just constant conjunction leads to some pretty strange conclusions.
Okay.
Like it would mean that the first time something ever happens, it couldn't have a cause.
Because it's never happened before, so it couldn't be constantly conjoined with anything.
Exactly. So how can anything ever happen for the first time?
Right, right.
Yeah.
So how did Reid think we should understand causation if it's not just constant conjunction?
Well, he made this distinction between physical causation and efficient causation. Physical causation is like the normal cause and effect we see in the world, like one billiard ball hitting another and making it move.
Okay, makes sense. What about efficient causation?
For Reid, efficient causation was like a deeper level of causation that's behind physical causation.
Right.
It's the power of an agent, something with a mind, to actually bring about an event.
So it's not just about things bumping into each other in the physical world.
Yeah.
It's about things with minds like us having the power to act and make things happen.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting because Reid connects this idea of efficient causation to free will.
Okay.
He's basically saying that when we act freely, we are the efficient cause of our own actions.
Mhm.
We're not just reacting to external forces or being driven by our desires.
So we actually have the power to choose.
Right. We have the power to initiate our own actions.
That's a pretty big claim, right? I mean, it goes against the whole idea of determinism, that everything is predetermined.
Absolutely. Reid was totally against determinism, and he had some great arguments against it.
Okay.
One of his arguments focused on this idea that determinists often use, that we always act on our strongest motive.
Okay.
Like whatever desire or motivation is strongest at a given moment, that's what determines our actions.
And what's wrong with that idea? It seems to make sense.
Well, Reid points out that this idea is either just plain false or it's trivially true depending on how you define strongest motive.
Okay.
Like sometimes we do things that are clearly in our best interest, even when we have a stronger urge to do something else, like resisting that extra slice of cake or getting up early to exercise even though you'd rather sleep in.
Yeah, I've been there.
Right. But a determinist might say that the desire to be healthy or lose weight, that was actually the strongest motive in those cases.
I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, but Reid says that defining strongest motive that way basically makes the whole claim meaningless. It doesn't really tell us anything useful about human behavior.
So he's suggesting that there's something more going on than just calculating our strongest desire.
Yeah.
There's an element of genuine choice.
Exactly. And for Reid, that power to choose is a key part of being human. It's what makes us moral agents who are responsible for our actions.
So he's not just critiquing determinism. He's giving a positive account of free will.
That's right.
So what does that look like?
Well, he lays out what he calls the 3 arguments for moral liberty. The first argument is based on the fact that we deliberate. He says the very act of deliberating, of weighing reasons for and against different choices, that already assumes we have the power to choose. If our actions were already predetermined, why would we even bother deliberating? It wouldn't change anything.
Right. Like if you're on a train that's already going to Chicago, there's no point in debating whether to get off at the next stop.
Exactly. His second argument has to do with moral responsibility. He thinks it only makes sense to hold people morally accountable for their actions if they could have chosen to act differently. If our actions are just the result of causes outside of us, then how can we be blamed or praised for them?
Right. It would be like blaming someone for getting sick when they were exposed to a virus.
Yeah.
It's not really their fault.
Exactly. And its third argument is a little more complex, but it basically comes down to the idea that planning for the future requires free will. He says we're constantly making plans, setting goals, and then taking steps to achieve them. And he argues that this kind of planned behavior wouldn't be possible if we weren't genuinely free to choose our actions.
So our ability to plan for the future, to make choices that shape our lives, is itself evidence for free will.
That's what Reid thought. Now, of course, none of these arguments are like foolproof, and philosophers are still debating free will today. But Reid's arguments provide a really compelling defense of this belief that we are free agents who can make real choices.
It's really interesting how he takes these complex philosophical problems and grounds them in our everyday experience.
That's Reid for you. He always brings it back to common sense.
Now, we've talked about perception, causation, free will. What about memory? How does Reid see memory fitting into all of this?
Oh, memory is another fascinating area where Reid really challenges some of the dominant views of his time, but maybe we should save that for next time. We could use a little break after all this talk about free will.
Yeah, good idea. We'll pick up with memory and then explore some of Reid's other ideas about personal identity, morality, and maybe even touch on his views on aesthetics and philosophy of religion.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, so back to Reid. We've talked about a lot of like perception, causation, free will, even a bit about memory. I feel like we're really starting to understand this whole common sense philosophy thing he's got going on.
It's definitely a different approach. He's really focused on connecting philosophy back to how we actually experience the world.
Exactly. So what else can we learn from Reid today?
Well, let's talk about personal identity. This is where he really takes on another big name, John Locke.
Oh yeah, Locke. He had that whole theory about personal identity being based on memory, right? Like it's our memories that connect us to our past selves and make us who we are.
Exactly. But Reid wasn't so sure about that. He thought Locke had kind of mixed up consciousness, memory, and personal identity. He said that being aware of something right now is different from remembering something from the past, and both of those are different from what makes you you over time.
So just because I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning doesn't mean I'm not the same person I was when I ate it.
Exactly. Our memories can be fuzzy, they can fade, we can even forget things completely. But Reid's point is that our sense of self, of being a continuous person, that stays the same even when our memories change.
That makes sense. So if memory isn't the key to personal identity for Reid, what is? What's his alternative?
He thought we have a more basic, more intuitive sense of self, like we just know we're the same person from one moment to the next, even if we change and grow and our memories aren't always perfect.
It's like I might not be able to explain why I'm the same person, but I just know that I am.
Exactly. It's another example of him appealing to common sense, to those basic beliefs that we all have about ourselves and the world.
So he's saying we don't need some fancy philosophical theory to explain who we are. We just know.
Right. And he didn't try to come up with a super precise definition of the self. He actually thought it was kind of a mystery. But he insisted that we all have this direct experience of our own existence, our own continuity over time.
Okay, so we've talked about perception, causation, free will, memory, personal identity. What about morality? Where does Reid stand on all the big questions about right and wrong, good and evil?
Ah, yes. Morality. This is where he tries to find a middle ground between two big schools of thought, the rationalists and the sentimentalists.
Remind me again, what were those two camps all about?
So the rationalists, they thought morality was all about logic and reason. Like you could figure out what's right and wrong just by thinking about it really hard.
Okay, so kind of like figuring out a math problem.
Exactly. And they believed that moral principles were universal, the same for everyone, no matter what.
Okay, what about the sentimentalists? They sound a little more fun.
Yeah, they were more about feelings and emotions. They said it's our gut reactions, our feelings of sympathy or disgust that tell us what's right and wrong.
So morality is more subjective for them, more about how we feel as individuals.
Right. Now, Reid thought both sides had a point, but he wasn't totally satisfied with either one. He thought the rationalists were too cold and detached, ignoring the role of emotions. And he thought the sentimentalists were too focused on fleeting feelings without a solid basis for their moral judgments.
So being Reid, he's looking for a way to bring those two views together.
Exactly. He thought we have something called a moral sense. It's like a faculty of the mind that allows us to perceive moral truths, kind of like how we perceive the shape or color of an object.
So just like I can see that a ball is round, I can also, through this moral sense, see that lying is wrong.
Yeah, that's the idea. But he was careful to say it's not just about feeling a certain way. Like, I might feel disgusted by a cruel act, but that feeling is different from the judgment that the act is wrong.
Okay, so the feeling is there, but it's not the whole story.
Right. He said moral judgments go beyond just gut reactions or emotional impulses. And this moral sense, he didn't think it was just random or subjective. It's based on fundamental moral principles that he called moral first principles. He said any rational person with a working conscience would recognize these principles as true.
Interesting. So what are some examples of these moral first principles?
Well, he thought we have a natural duty to care about the well-being of others, to treat people fairly and justly, and to keep our promises. These kinds of principles, he thought, forms the foundation of a moral life.
So it's a combination of intuition, feeling, and these basic principles. We have this sense of what's right and wrong, but it's also guided by our emotions and these deeper moral truths.
You got it. It's a complex picture, but I think it captures a lot of how we actually experience morality in our own lives.
Man, we've covered so much ground today. But there's still a couple of areas we haven't even touched on yet: aesthetics and philosophy of religion.
You're right. But we can at least try to squeeze them in. Let's start with aesthetics. Reid's view of art was actually pretty ahead of its time. He was one of the first to emphasize the role of expression in art.
So for him, it's not just about pretty colors or shapes arranged in a nice way. It's about something more.
Exactly. He said true art has to express something deeper, the artist's feelings, thoughts, ideas. A great work of art, for Reid, is one that lets us see into the artist's inner world to share their perspective.
So like a beautiful landscape painting, it's not just about how realistically it depicts the trees and mountains. It's about how the artist felt about that landscape, what they wanted to communicate through their art.
That's a great way to put it. And he believed that this expressive quality is what makes art so powerful, so moving. It's about connecting with the artist's mind and heart through their work.
It's like that saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But Reid's adding to that the artist plays a big role in creating that experience of beauty by expressing their inner world.
Exactly. And then finally, we come to philosophy of religion. This was obviously a big one for Reid, given his own strong faith.
Right. But I know he wasn't trying to come up with some airtight, logical proof for God's existence, the way some philosophers tried to do.
He wasn't. He was skeptical of those traditional arguments, the cosmological argument, the design argument, all those. He thought they had their weaknesses, and he didn't want to reduce belief in God to just a purely intellectual exercise.
So instead of trying to prove God, he was more focused on showing that belief in God was rational and reasonable.
Exactly. He said it's a basic principle of common sense, something that most people naturally believe. It's a foundational belief, like believing that the world exists outside of our minds or that our senses are generally reliable.
Like he's saying, look, we all believe in God. It's not some crazy irrational thing. It's a natural part of being human.
Exactly. And for Reid, belief in God wasn't just some abstract idea, it had real implications for how we live our lives. It informed his views on morality, on purpose, on how we treat each other.
This has been an incredible journey through the world of Thomas Reid. It's amazing how much ground we covered, and I feel like we've just scratched the surface.
He was such a deep thinker, always challenging assumptions and pushing us to look at things in new ways.
What I really appreciate about Reid is how grounded he is. He doesn't get lost in abstract theories. He's always bringing it back to our experience, to what makes sense to us as human beings.
That's what makes him so relevant, even today. His emphasis on common sense, on the importance of lived experience, on free will, moral responsibility, these are all themes that are still being debated and discussed by philosophers today.
It's like he gave us a toolkit for thinking about life's big questions in a way that's both rigorous and relatable.
Absolutely. So, to bring it all back to the bigger picture, I think what Reid offers us is a way of approaching philosophy and life in general that's both intellectually challenging and deeply human. He encourages us to question, to examine our experiences, to trust our intuitions but not blindly, and to be okay with not having all the answers.
It's a call to be both critical thinkers and humble observers of the world, always open to new insights and deeper understanding.
And on that note, we leave you with one final thought. If Reid is right and our common sense intuitions can guide us toward truth, what other truths might we uncover if we take the time to really examine our own experiences with open minds and curious hearts?